All right. Welcome back, everyone, to another Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business technology and the human experience. It has been a little bit since I've been sitting behind the desk, behind the mic. So I am fired up and looking forward to get back on the whatever, I don't know, bull, something like that. I don't know. I'm still in vacation mode, so it's going to take me a little bit. But I'm looking forward to it because we're going to be talking about what goes into behavior change and the role technology can play in that. And ultimately, how do you know whether you're doing that well through measurement and analytics and what kind of insights? But ultimately, what you have to do to actually make that happen, because this is more you're going to hear through this conversation. It's more than bolting on a generative AI bot to what you're doing and clapping your hands and walking away and going, I think we figured it out. So to have that conversation with me, I've got I've got Chris Taylor with me. So it's going to be Chris and Christopher, which will be really easy to distinguish for all of you watching and listening. And he's from Actionable. And so, Chris, thank you so much for joining me on this. Here it's a snowy Tuesday afternoon.
Also snow. Finally, my 3-year-old announced yesterday that because it had snowed, Santa could come. I'm like, dude, you short-term memory loss. But that's the 3-year-old mindset. So no, thank you so much for having me.
Is it short-term memory loss, or is it one of those things where it's kind of like, hey, Dad, we could do Christmas again?
Yeah,
just totally. Saying, kind of one of those passive, childish.
The non-conformist. Why every 365 days? It doesn't have to wait. We can do it again now, right?
Why can't we do Christmas twice in a month? I'm all for it.
Exactly.
That's funny. So you got the snow there too, because we're supposed to get like a foot today. We're getting completely bombed.
Yeah, same. And we've had nothing for a while, so we've all forgotten how to drive and how to walk in anything wet or cold. Yeah.
It's the running joke in the Midwest of all, and probably anywhere that there's snow, that you would think by now we'd learn how to deal with this, but we don't. And the first snow of the year, which, hey, I'll take it. Mid-January, first snow, I'm not complaining. Like, we'll see if I even need to fire up the snowblower because it seems to be melting off. So I'm not complaining, but yeah.
Agreed.
Well, for those who may not be familiar with you, so I've gotten to know you through the pre-show work and just the conversations leading up to this. But for those who may not be familiar with Chris Taylor and what you're doing at Actionable,
sure,
tell folks who you are and what you do.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, and as a small point of clarity, it's actionable.co. The poor folks at actionable.com, which is a analytics research house in Texas, just keep getting bombarded with emails looking for us. So actionable.co is in the L&D space. We are focused on sustaining and measuring behavior change as a bridge on learning programs between what happens in the room and the impact that we want to create within the organization.
Okay.
So put more practically, we're a tech platform that learning departments utilize in their training and really people development programs in general to help learners put ideas into practice and to measure the change it's creating.
Well, and I think where we're going to get into this today, that for folks who are listening to this and thinking about this, because sometimes these conversations can be extremely relevant to L&D professionals, but really when we think about behavior change and everything that's changing in the world right now, this is extremely relevant to anyone, because I don't know that there's a single conversation I've had in the last, 36 months or something like that with someone who hasn't said changing people's skills and behavior is super important to us right now. And knowing that we're actually accomplishing it, because it's one thing to say we're changing behavior, but we're in January, and I can tell you right now, there's a whole bunch of people who have committed to healthy living and fitness that come March are going to be right back to where they were in November. So we'll talk about that.
Well, it's funny. We talk about the New Year's Eve moment in the classroom, right? Where it's that point where, and those who facilitate on this call, this moment, it's where you've just sort of got the group in the flow, right? Like they're with you, they're laughing at your jokes. They're nodding their heads. They seem inspired and the knowledge is fresh, and they make these broad sweeping declarations, right? Like, I'm going to be a better leader. I'm going to be a better listener. And then they leave the room. And then exactly to your point, the equivalent of January 21st comes around and everyone's depressed, or they've forgotten about it because nothing actually changed. So that's,
but to your point, and we're going to get into this because I have a follow-up question for you that has nothing to do with this piece. But I think the thing with it is, like you just said right there, one of the dangers is we can oversimplify
Yeah.
or over exaggerate behavior change, where
Yeah.
it's like, I'm going to get fit,
Right.
going to be a better leader. It's like, well, what the heck does that mean? And if
Right.
you break that down into tangible actions and behaviors that you can then measure, then really you're not going to get anywhere because you don't even really know where you're going. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, you can, there's probably lots of sayings, but like if you throw a dart and then place the dartboard wherever the dart lands, like you're always going to hit the target. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes that's what happens. Like, I'm going to be a better leader
Yeah.
as defined by whatever I become in 6 months. And then that's accomplishing my goal, or vice versa. Well, I didn't accomplish it.
That's my parallel on that is, I'm gonna get in shape. It's like, great. Well, you're already a shape. So what shape exactly are you planning on becoming, right? Over there.
I'm going to get into whatever shape I will be when I decide to measure that shape.
Yeah, exactly. Slightly more round. That's right.
But so before we get into that, for you, so what is your background? And obviously now you're running a tech analytics company.
Yep.
Was that kind of the vision? Were you a spreadsheet junkie for a while and then went, you know what, why there's a better, like, how did you go down this road?
Yeah. So I started in film school. So no, I would say I
Oh,
went.
naturally. Okay. That makes perfect sense. Film school. I got it.
This is it. No, I mean the short version of the 20-year journey is I was in film school. I really fell in love with I didn't know this at the time, but it was the people dynamics, right? It was around how a group of humans comes together, you manage egos to create this, this new outcome. But that wasn't, I left film school, graduated film school and said, I can either spend 20 years running coffee and work my way up, or I can go make millions elsewhere and then come back and make movies. So as the, wide-eyed 22-year-old, I said, that's what I'm going to do. So I went into sales and marketing. And no, so it's been a very convoluted path to the short answer to your question, Christopher. But I went into sales and marketing. I started reading a lot of business books to sort of, develop my chops because I had no formal training in business.
Okay.
And I fell in love with the genre of business books and practical personal development books. And I was reading voraciously, but found that nothing was actually changing in my life because I was consuming content, not applying it. And so I became really kind of obsessed.
You mean the 300th TED Talk didn't magically make you the greatest leader in the world?
Suddenly
I can't believe it.
I know. Well, and it took a bit for it to get through my skull. But I sort of fell in love with what Bob Sutton calls the knowing doing gap, right? How do we bridge that from consumption to application? And as importantly, lasting application. Okay. So my first foray into this world was a website called actionablebooks.com, which was quite literally that. It was, how do I take good to great and actually put the hedgehog concept into practice? How do I take, etc. And so I did that for about 300 books and became, through testing on myself, sort of, I'm like a geeky Tim Ferriss, testing on myself the, how do you make improvements? But that led me into understanding the work of BJ Fogg and Charles Duhigg's books that just come out. And so I became really interested in behavior change, in culture, in org design theory, and was really a student for 12 years of that space before I launched the initial iteration of what's now actionable.co.
Okay. Super cool. Super. Well, it's interesting. Two things that just in your journey that stand out based on a number of conversations I've had over the years is, something that's very interesting. And I did a whole podcast with someone on this, is there's this idea that creative people don't, like, there's this category for creative people, and oftentimes they won't do well in tech because tech is about logical and process and all these things. And actually some of the most brilliant tech people I've encountered are people who were creative. One of the gentlemen who was on the show just a few weeks ago, he was a DJ and he had a whole music career doing DJ, but the creativity and the ability to think outside the box and go, well, why do we do things this way? And being able to bend it in a different way actually took it. So the fact that you went from film school, realized, I could just barista till I'm 50 and maybe get a shot at doing something, and went, or maybe I could just reinvent my own path, doesn't surprise me. But I am curious on the behavior change one, because I run into the same frustrations and see this a lot. There is this persistent belief and this isn't just in the learning field, I see this everywhere, that if we just know enough information, we'll figure it out and we'll do something different. And the reality is that just doesn't happen. And so in your journey and going through this,
Yeah.
what were some of the biggest things that you saw that led, what do you think leads to that continued misconception? Because I see a lot of people, when you bring this up, they nod their heads and they go, yes, I agree. And then
Mhm.
you're like, so what are you doing about it? And they're like, well, I'm reading a book on it. And you're
Mhm.
like, you just told me that consuming more content is not leading to behavior change,
Yeah.
but the solution consistently is I'm going to learn more. It's
Yeah.
like, but are you really learning?
Well, I think, it's a great question. I think the couple thoughts in here for me, maybe for some people, there's the narcissistic, I'm the special snowflake that doesn't actually need a system. There might be part of that for some people.
Okay.
Uh,
Everybody else needs it, but I don't. I'm the one
right.
who can just
Maybe.
translate
Right.
all my.
Exactly. I'll figure it out. But I think for others, it's I know how to buy a book, and for most of us, know how to read the book. Right. So I know how to do that. And it's logical as to what the next step is. I think the challenge with application is that a lot of us don't take the time and apply the energy to figure out what that path is going to look like. And so we end up with these sweeping statements of I'm going to be a better leader, or just, and not even, sometimes not even a statement. It's just like, well, I read the book, so now I'm going to be better at this topic, right? Without actually even having an end state.
Yeah.
And I think, at least in my experience, one of the breakdowns is chunking down small enough the next step that I can actually take on. Because I think, just like most of us think we're above average drivers, most of us think we're capable of doing more and changing more than we actually are. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
that ability or that muscle development of I think BJ Fogg calls it the laughably small first step, right? Like, what's the thing that's so micro that I can, it's easier just to do it than it is to justify not doing it. And if
Okay.
you haven't done the work to sort of map that out, the likelihood of actually taking action is pretty low.
Well, and it's funny. So, Kristen, your comment is spot on. Um, but I think this is something that is grossly underestimated when it
Yeah.
comes to this. And I deal with this all the time in the business sector of talking to people where leaders go, we need to change this. And we don't always recognize changing behavior is extremely,
Yeah.
extremely difficult. It's not something that you just say, here, just do this real quick and magically. And again, I think even just what you described, be a better leader. It's also very multifaceted.
100%.
When you talk about changing behavior, even saying, I'm going to be a better communicator.
Nope.
I mean, there's 100 different skills within that it's like, well, which one are you going to improve on? I mean, eye contact alone. If
Yep.
you're just like, I'm going to get better at eye contact.
Yep.
That would be hard. And then you're like, well, but there's 73 other things that I also need to tweak.
Yep. So just to get into actionable for half a second for context. So one of the tools that we have is called the Habit Builder.
Okay.
What the Habit Builder does is it allows participants at the end of a learning event to make a commitment to a daily practice based on something that they learned. And we have quite literally tens of millions of data points to identify how to craft those commitments in a way that's most effective. Okay. And the most effective way is to make it into something that is 30 seconds or less that can be done on a daily basis. It's not, event based. It's tied to, I have control over it. I can do it daily, right? As opposed to when my boss yells at me. You put that in front of the buyer of the program who's spending 150 grand or investing, X number of people hours into the program. And you say, hey, leaving this first module that's a day-long session on all these things related to communication, the thing that they're going to commit to is making eye contact in one meeting every day, right? And the buyer goes, or the stakeholder says, well, that's ridiculous. That's not enough. We need more.
Yeah, $150,000 for people to make better eye contact. Like,
right.
I can't. That's the value prop's just not there.
Right. And I think the challenge is that we're looking at learning in that sort of time compressed event based piece and saying it all needs to happen right now, where we know that change happens incrementally and it happens over time. So we need to stack the behavior changes one on top of each other, one on top of another over the next X number of months. One of my female colleagues put it very succinctly when she said, you can't take 9 pregnant women and put them in a room and have a baby in 1 month. It takes things happen in sequence.
As
Where
a father of 7, I can 100% say, yeah, that's good math right there.
it's
You
9 months,
cannot
give or
speed
take.
up 9 babies by just simply bringing them all into the room at the same time.
Right. So if you want a more effective communicator, you can't do a 1-day workshop and then say shift these 7 behaviors in the month following. It's run the
Yeah.
1-day workshop, or better still, run an hour-long workshop, have them shift one behavior, rinse and repeat for 7 months. And that's what it takes to make that change happen, depending on what the scope of the change is. And I think this is where we get into odds. You and I were talking beforehand about, yes, but I want it faster. Like,
Yeah.
great, but that's not how humans work. We're not in the Matrix, right? We can't just plug in and know kung fu. It takes
No.
time, right?
Well, and I think going back to, so what are, because we're good guys, so I know where I'm going next with this, but one of the things that you just brought up is, as individual practitioners on the business side, this is something, and we have not done ourselves any service into this kind of instant gratification
Yeah.
of, oh, you need this, here, we'll do this thing, because it does start to set this expectation that behavior change is easy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you want your leaders to have better one-on-ones? Let's spend 90 minutes on Wednesday with all your leaders and they'll have better one-on-ones. And we know, no, they won't. In fact, most of them will get to the end of their day and have forgotten
Mm-hmm.
93% of what you even talked about in that meeting, because all the rest of the distractions. And so when we set these expectations and we don't do the hard work up front of going, hey, what behaviors are we really trying to change?
Yep.
And are we committed to actually taking the time to change those behaviors?
Yep.
Because if we're not, we really are just wasting people's time. And that leads to that cognitive fatigue of,
Yep.
I'm just burned out.
Yeah. I mean, I made the crack about, not being in the Matrix. Maybe one day we'll get to that point where you can literally plug in and suddenly have the muscle memory around that thing.
Well, what I'm talking about it on Friday.
There you go.
Musk has got Neuralink going, so who
It's
knows?
all
Like
happening. Who knows? We'll all be out of job. But in the meantime, it's that acknowledgement that we are analog beings, and that so the change is going to take time, right? And just everyone being okay with that, or to your point, not starting in the first place, right? Like if this change has to happen by Friday, it's not going to happen. So let's stop pretending that it's going to and wasting resources on it.
Well, and even going back to, let's say hypothetically, because this is a tech show and we talk about the future of tech, but even hypothetically, let's say one of these, companies makes a breakthrough with a chip in your head that can download information into your brain and teach you all the things that you need to know overnight. I still don't think we appreciate the complexity of how complicated behavior actually is, because it's about no more than just knowing what to do.
100%.
It's actually battling against the emotional barriers to doing it, even the muscle memory, all these things that are going on that you can't just download that information into your head and go, oh, okay. Because I think most people, some of these things that we talk about changing behavior on, that you look at the top list of skills that companies need to invest in. I think most people, if you had a conversation, could articulate what they know they should be doing. Oftentimes it's not a knowledge, like nobody's like, oh, I don't know. I think treating my people like dirt is a great way to be a manager.
Right.
Nobody says that. They know what they should do. It's like, well, why aren't you doing it then? And it's because it's far more complicated than simply saying, well, know it.
Yeah. We talk about sort of the 3 components, right? So there's a knowledge piece, but to your point, in many cases, the content, right, of the thing. But in many cases, we already have that. It's not usually about new content. It's about reminders, right? But that's really the least of the 3 in driving change. The second part is, I need a strong enough why, right? You talk about the emotional components, and Keegan and Leahy talk about the immunity to change, right? All the resistance that we have internally to even making that change, even though intellectually we know we should quit smoking. We're thinking that we're pondering that while we're out on the corner. Not me, but others. There's an emotional component around the change. We need a strong enough reason to want to change. And then we need to do the reps, right, of actually practicing this, because we have pre-existing patterns of behavior and we need to overcome those, right, in establishing the new norm. And all 3 pieces need to be true in order to actually create lasting change in particular. So,
Well, and this complexity is not, and I think this is where, while tech is dramatically improving certain things, there are certain things we can shortcut. And I think this is something that practitioners and just business leaders in general need to be very careful of, is does even with all this advancement in technology,
Mm-hmm.
changing human behavior, going back to the great analogy by your coworker that 9 women in a room doesn't make a baby in a month, it doesn't. There's some things we can't shortcut. And technology is not going to, it may be able to cut certain things out and optimize certain levels of efficiency, but we're not going to get to a point where it's like we need to dramatically change the behavior of all this
Yep.
segment of our employee population.
Yep.
And you go, hey, you know what? Great. There's this new widget out there. All we got to do is flip a switch. And next week, everybody's going to be doing it. Piece of cake. No
Yeah.
problem.
No, 100%. I mean, that's a conversation we have with new clients right out of the gate, just to make sure everyone's level setting, is that tech can be a great enabler of that behavior change journey. It can bring visibility to organizational change. It can increase the probabilities that change is taking place on a personal, team, or organizational level, but not by itself. You referenced at the very beginning, not as a bolt-on. It needs to be considered in the system that is focused on creating change, identifying what that desired change is, why it matters, and then sort of working backwards to say, this is how we design the program to maximize change. And yes, tech's a part of that. It's not the thing, right, that makes the change happen.
Well, and that actually, I told you I knew where I was going next. It just took me a little bit to get there because there were some things I wanted to hit on. But that's actually one of the things that I consistently see as an opportunity area is, one, there's not always a full understanding of the complexity of behavior change.
Yep.
But then also what we talked about is we often end up trying to solve that at the wrong point in time.
Yep.
And that's what we were talking about backstage, where a lot of times it's like we go through a change and then we get to the other side and we go, did it work? And it's like, did it work? Like, what does work mean? What were we trying to do? And so really facilitating actual measurable behavior change means you've got to tear the engine apart and rebuild it, because it's not the same thing. You can't just keep doing what you're doing. And I'm sure you deal with that on your end, where people go, all right, hey, we're doing all this great stuff. We're hoping we can slap an analytics platform on the back end and suddenly be churning out ROI metrics. And I have to imagine you've encountered that in the past.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is, and I love you slid it in there saying we're doing all this great work, where again, I'm not going to say you're not you, but whoever's not doing great work, but how are you defining great? Because for a lot of people in the learning space, great has been about experience design, right? It's been around participants' minds being blown in the session and coming away going, that was the greatest learning event I've ever been to, referring to the experience that they had, not to the change that it created. And so if you then try to measure, it can almost be a disservice when we've over-indexed on experience, because everything is being serving that. And then we try to measure impact. It's like, well, that wasn't the objective of the design. So how, it's going to fall flat. And then you get people, I don't trust the metrics because they're saying we didn't do a good job. It's like, no, it's saying you didn't focus on impact. It's saying you focused on experience, right?
They loved it. They loved it, but nothing changed as a result of it. Yeah. And that's what the data is telling us.
Yeah. I appreciate that Kirkpatrick Phillips has been used for decades, and there's lovers and there's haters, and I don't want to get into that. But what I do like about it is that it's a pretty good visual around participant satisfaction is the base level here, right? It's useful, but
it's useful because if people hate it, they're not going to participate in it to even get you anywhere else. Yeah. So you can't, and I think that's an important call out, that we're not saying experience doesn't matter. Who cares? Because it does. It just doesn't stop there.
Right. Well, and I think if we put it in very practical terms, if you think about the budget allocated to a program, you've got sort of the base participant experience where people are going to find it enjoyable, right? To your point, if you spend the extra 10 grand on the Cirque du Soleil performer to come in at lunchtime, is that actually the effective use of time or dollars, or could it be applied to actually what happens after the session to focus on sustaining, the efforts after the event is complete? So it actually impacts budget, it impacts design, it impacts how much content we try to squish into a session when we shift the focus from experience to one of impact.
Okay. Well, and I think, we won't get into all I tend to, and this is just because I spend so much time talking with non-learning people.
Yep.
I don't like to get into the whole theories and the academics because their eyes just glaze over and they're like, I don't really care about. But to your point, when we really think about this, I've always looked at measurement as storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what you're trying to do is you're trying to tell a compelling story, which
Mm-hmm.
does a compelling story need great characters and a great plot line? It does, but it's also got to have right a great conclusion and all these other things. And when you think about that holistic, like, does it matter? Hey, did people find it enjoyable? Did it grab their attention? Well, yeah. If you don't enjoy the first chapter of a book, you normally don't finish it.
Yep.
But at the same time, that isn't the end of the story. And I think that's sometimes where we miss it is we're so compelled on one chapter of the book. We don't go, well, right. But did they read the whole book and did they do something in response to the book?
Mm-hmm. There's someone shared the stat with me, and I don't know if it's an urban myth or not. I haven't validated. I probably should. But it's the stat that I'd heard was that of all the people who have died summiting Everest, 80+% died on the way back down, not on the way up the mountain. I share that for two reasons. One is, what's the objective when you're going to summit Everest? Is the objective to summit Everest, or is it to summit and make it home safely? Right? There's different, depending on the desired outcome, you're going to put emphasis into the appropriate phases of the journey. As you're telling the story about that, if I end the story, if the chapter end is them reaching the summit, it's a good news story, right? But if I extend the story to look at the full journey back down, it tells a very different story, to your point. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Well, and what's interesting though with that, and again, whether the statistics are true or not, I think it really illustrates a really relevant point, because one of the challenges is, and I think this is the challenge that you're in if you're in the business of trying to change behavior, is let's say you're a Sherpa selling, getting people, right? We're just going to keep going with it, right? You're a Sherpa selling trips to the top of Mount Everest. Marketing and selling, I will get you to the top of Mount Everest, sells more trips.
Yeah.
You're going to get more people that go, heck yeah, I want to get to the top of Mount Everest. But if you really think about what actually matters, it's, well, I want to go home safely.
Right.
That's what really matters. But that doesn't sell trips to go, hey, we'll make sure you don't die on the mountain.
Right. Less compelling.
That's not great marketing, because people are like, well, duh, I hope I don't die on the mountain. But they don't realize that it's like, well, but if you are solely focused on just getting to that peak, then you are not going to set the right objectives because you're only focused on getting to the top. And that's not the most, that's only half the journey type of a thing. I think it's the same thing when you think about behavior change. We're so focused on the event. It's like, right, but that's only half the journey. That's not actually where the behavior change carries forward. But that's hard work, not only selling that the right way, but actually pulling it off.
Yeah. Well, let's use it just one more time.
Let's do it. I like it. I'm a Sherpa now. This is great.
Because I think so. Part of the job of the Sherpa in that case, in my opinion, is to prime the climbers at the beginning before they set foot at base camp to say, hey, just so we're all on the same page, we want to get to the summit, we want to get the obligatory picture, and then we want to get back down safely. And so we're going to summit this in a way that increases the probability of you making it home safely, right? So I'm going to ask you to hold back on some of your energy on this. I'm going to ask you to not overcommit on that, etc. So it's partially around what the Sherpa does tactically in the room and beyond, and it's also about how they are taking a role in conditioning the learner / climber to actually think about the journey itself as well, right?
No, and I think that's not even just with the employee or the person who's behavior changing. It's really everyone involved in that process. Because as I think about conversations I'll have with other senior leaders about this, there's a lot of effort going into, hey, if we really want to see this behavior change, we need to think critically about what actually goes into that, because otherwise we're spending a lot of time and money on vapor. Well, I mean, we might as well just take a bunch of dollars, put it in a trash barrel and light it on fire, because if we're not going to commit to coming home safely, we might as well not do anything at all. And we got plenty of things to do. Yeah.
Well, I think it's almost even worse. And this is why you see senior employees, in my opinion, who some are jaded and cynical towards training. because early in
Absolutely.
their career, they had this belief that it was going to drive change or that they were going to
Yes.
change as a result, and then it failed. So it's almost worse than not doing it at all because you are disenfranchising employees from, when I do this thing, oh, nothing actually happens. So maybe I'll just lean back on some other stuff too, right? So
I take flack for it sometimes, a
no,
lot of times, but I talk people out of learning as an intervention far more than I talk them into it, because that is the default go-to. Well, we
yeah,
should just teach people this and they'll be better at it.
yeah, spray them with
And
content.
9 times out of 10, I'm like, no, because if we're not really going to commit to doing it, we are wasting their time.
Yeah,
And honestly, with everything going on in the world and all the things people are dealing with, it's an offense to our employees to go, we need your time and attention and your resources committed to this.
yep,
For what? Mm, no real reason. You're not going to see any real tangible benefit or any gain from this. We just
right.
actually, we really want to waste your time because
Mhm.
we figure you have plenty of it. And we're going to ask you to pick up the slack somewhere else. Are you game?
Right.
It's honestly, if we really worded it that way, like we'd get thrown out of the room, but we don't always realize that that is exactly what we're doing
Yeah.
when we say, hey, we didn't really put the work into this. We're not really going to commit to the rest of it.
Right.
But your expectations, which you hit on, are really important, because if you frame that up to people,
Yeah.
people are much more inclined to go, okay,
Yeah.
I'm on board. That makes sense to me.
This is going to sound deceptively simple, but I'd encourage anyone who's listening that is pitching or being involved in the proposal for a learning program to ask the question as literally one of the very first questions before you get into any logistics around, just so I'm clear, what are we trying to do here? Is this about the experience in the room, or is this about driving some sort of real change? And then stop talking. For a lot of us, we go, well, that's kind of insulting because it's so assumptive and it's offensive. I'm like, right, but wait and see what happens, because one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to get immediate clarity on the fact that actually this is just an experience bonus for folks. They've been burnt out. We just want to give them an event. Awesome. There's a time and place for that. Let that be over
Yeah.
there, right? But if they say change, then being able to revisit that's your hook to come back to constantly, to be able to say, hey, we said we wanted to work on change. This is what it's going to take to change. Are we still game on change, or is this actually an experience? Asking that framing question out of the gate of everyone that is in a decision-making capacity will stimulate deeper and richer conversation than you might expect, or it'll make very clear that there's no point in trying to push an uphill battle on change here, because that's not the point, which is fine.
Which I'm so glad you brought this up, because this right here is one of the like core things that you have to, and there's an art and a science to it, because to your point, you can do this and piss a lot of people off.
Sure.
I mean, if you do this wrong, you can piss a lot of people off, because if you come at this from a position of arrogance, or you seem like a know-it-all or whatever, you're going to get thrown out of the room. They're going to be like, who is this jerk?
Right.
Who, of course, we know what we're doing here. So you have to do it delicately. But your point is spot on, that asking that question can be one of the most revealing things that can happen. And I can't tell you how many times in my career where I've going into it gone, before we even start talking logistics, because everybody jumps to solutioning.
100%.
Well, we're going to do this, and let's do this, and what are the dates and how long's, versus before we get into that, can we just talk about what are we really hoping to accomplish through this?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it is met with, oh, we didn't.
Hadn't thought about that.
I guess we didn't. Bob, did you have that? Jill, shoot. And there have been plenty of times where people have had to go back to the drawing board and gone,
yeah,
we didn't actually really think about that. And I'm actually glad we discussed this now before we wasted a bunch of people's time. But I think the other point you bring up that's really good is it's okay if sometimes it is just about the experience.
100%. Yeah. I fought that sort of tooth and nail 15 years ago. So I was like, no, every event must be around, radical change, but it's just not true, right? There's a time and a place for those events, but particularly in this, frenetic pace, to take some time out and to do the ropes course or whatever. And cool, like there's stuff in there.
Right. Everybody goes home. They had fun. They felt like the company invested in them. They're a little more engaged in their work. They're no different on Monday than they were on Friday at the ropes course. But we don't care, because there's something innately valuable
Yep.
about making people feel invested in. And
Yep.
if that's your goal,
Yep. Yeah.
and I love that you said you used to be on that camp, because I've gotten into it with practitioners who there is this like pendulum swing where they sometimes come from the it's all fluff and bean bags and hookah lounge and like we're just here to have a good time. And then they jump the other way and they're like, if we can't nail down the measurable, tangible behavior change, we're not doing it. And it's like, well, there's room in the middle for that. We've just maybe over-indexed.
It's just, to me, it's as important to be crystal clear on the fact that this is not about behavior change as it is where it is about behavior change, because that's where it can muddy the waters as well, right? It feels very weird when you do the offsite with your team and then afterwards, like, all right, team, what are we going to do differently leaving the session based on this? Like, it just sort of like, it took all the magic out of that experience by trying to make it a work thing, right? And so,
and that's you run into that when people have like offsites, and then they have this weird obligation to be like, we really should throw some training in here to feel like we can justify this, instead of being like, no, you're just celebrating time with just go have fun with your team. We don't need to have a core lesson with an action plan at the end of everything that we do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think, that's my biggest thing. I also think as a practitioner, I talked to a lot of people in the learning or OD function or, outside consultants that want to elevate their status from sort of order taker to being more that consultative business partner in the true sense, right? Of business partner. And I think asking that question on the front end, well, not I think, I've seen it many, many times, is an opportunity to open that door a little bit. Because when they're doing the thing of going, Bob, Jill, do we? No. Being able to say, okay, well, here's a couple of questions that you can prompt the conversation, right? To actually start getting them thinking about what behaviors they're trying to change and why those matter to the organization.
I completely agree. And I think this is where sometimes that innate desire to please is actually detrimental to some of the goals we have. I mean, this goes back to everything we say we don't want to be order takers. Well, then quit taking orders type of a thing, but it's so natural to go, sweet, they called us. Let's make them happy. They said they want a thing. We can execute on that versus, well, if your goal is really to be the strategic partner, then yes, it might be a little uncomfortable when you go, have we mapped out what we're trying to do here yet? Are we clear on that? And people look around kind of, oh, I don't want to. All right, let's just own the awkwardness. It's okay. Let's talk about that now. Before we start going here, let's take some time to do that and take the reins. And that can be a very powerful way to play that strategic partner of, all right, hey, no big deal. It's fine. Nobody's offended. You're not an idiot for getting here. It happens all the time. Let's just talk about what do we really want to do with it?
Yep, 100%. Well, I think there's an interesting ripple effect here where if you step into that, if you're talking to someone who's come to you with the initial request and they have a boss, you can help them come back to their boss with smarter questions around what we're trying to achieve here, right? So you can become an enabler through the organization. And the good news is that at the top or the end, depending on how you're structured, there are strategic priorities for the organization. And those strategic, in most cases, those strategic priorities are usually around achieving outcomes that we haven't achieved before, which typically means that people need to act in a way that's different than they've acted before. And as organizations, we have two choices then. We can either buy those capabilities or we can build them. And if we're building those capabilities, we've just started to develop a bit of a chain link between the strategic priorities, the competencies we need to develop, the behaviors that need to shift in order to develop those competencies, and the trainings or learning that we're putting together. We call it the impact value chain. But you can put that together in a very logical fashion. It's high level, it's napkin math, but it gives you a starting frame that people can agree to. Yeah, that logically makes sense. This is why we're focused on these behaviors as it pertains to the strategic priorities.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that no, but it's good. I think one of the things that, anybody watching or listening to this, I've talked to plenty of people. And so I want to reinforce this. This is not what we're talking about is a behavior change you have to make.
Right.
So it's hard. And I will just tell you right now, it is hard. And I've had people where I've talked to them and they go, I've tried that and I got my teeth kicked in. And I'm like, yes, you have. And you will. And you're going to piss people off because there are going to be people who go, shut up. I just want this done by next week. and you're going to have to fight against that. And you're going to have to learn sometimes when to back down and go, this isn't a hill to die on.
Yep.
It's fine. Some hills aren't worth dying on, and you got to know when to read that so that you can build some credibility to come back and go, we did that thing.
Yep.
It didn't really do anything. Let's talk about that next time. Like, I'm seeing a pattern. We keep doing this. Maybe let's have a discussion about what should we really be doing to get there? Because I've seen people try and die on every hill.
Yeah.
And they usually find themselves unemployed.
Right. Well, I think,
at some point,
because what we're talking about here is getting alignment from the senior stakeholders around the purpose of the program, which is gold standard. There's still silver and bronze medals in here to be collected, which I would suggest that if you don't have that clarity and they say, I just want you to run the program next week, you listener, have enough knowledge and insight around, well, if I run that program with that type of content, what type of behaviors would I hope are shifting? And you can focus on those, and you can put a system, you can design the session to be around maximizing behavior change. You're still going to get great participation scores. And if you have, soft plug for Actionable, a tool that is able to support the measurement of that change, you can then have the added benefit of saying, hey, I checked the box, I ran the session, and by the way, look at the behaviors that were shifting as a result. Which sometimes that's what it takes, right? Is you bringing real data for them to suddenly go, oh, this is interesting. I'd like to know more about this, or could we do that on the next thing? And you can start a bit of a flywheel, right? You don't have to get the gold standard out of the gate.
Yeah. And I think that just goes back to everything we've been talking about before, which is why I wanted to connect it to this in and of itself is a behavior change that you're looking at shifting, which means depending on where you are in that journey, I mean, if you haven't worked out in your whole life and you decide you're going to be a triathlete, it's probably going to take you a little longer than somebody who's been working out for 10 years and they want to become a triathlete. And that's okay. You kind of got to figure out where you are on that trajectory so you can figure out, all right, well, how much work do I have ahead? Because again, you're not going to win every gold medal and that's okay. You got to figure that out. And the other thing I would add on this one is don't put this in like an intake form. This is one of the
right.
Could I just say that like out loud? Because I do see this sometimes where people are like, you know what? And again, this is kind of like the training you go to. You're like, you know what? We're going to get better at this. We're going to create an intake form. And anybody who asks for training, we're going to send this. And I've seen these. I've been guilty of building them early in my career where you're like, all right, we're going to ask these questions. What measurable behavior you're going to change and all these things. And in a form, not in a discussion format, it does not go well because it seems like you're just creating barriers.
Right.
Instead of being a partner and going, let's figure this out.
I mean, beating the drum here on like you shift behaviors in order to create this change. They are also shifting behaviors. They likely haven't been asked what the desired outcomes are in that format. So you can't expect them to do that in a form, right? Forms are collecting information that we already have access to, not the stuff that we need to ideate. And that's, to your point, requires conversation, which I think it's doing yourself a disservice to put it in a form anyway, because you're not having the opportunity to play that consultative role, right? Which if you want to elevate your status, that's a great way to do it.
Well, and again, going back to things that you can do that will be a giant waste of your time and be a disservice to you. There's a great example of it because I've done it plenty of times and people either don't fill it out. They're annoyed by it. They're like, what the heck is this? You end up having the conversation anyway. And going back to, we're moving into an AI world where are you investing things that really are human things? This is a really good area to go. No, this is where you need a person engaging with somebody and also not only trying to get the information, but actually assessing, like, is this person you're talking to, are they under the gun because their boss just said, I need it next week. I've got an offsite. I have to do this thing. And are you just really going to make an enemy by going, I need all these answers before and you're like, this is not the time. And you're not going to get that in a form.
I'd love to double click on the mandatory versus sort of user choice in this case topic.
Yes, let's do it.
So I think, and you and I think we need to find something to disagree on, Christopher, because we're so in line on everything here. But yeah, fully in alignment, right? That it's a developed muscle for yourself. You're going to fall down a few times. It can take practice. You can't always expect that you're going to get it. So you need to make it optional. And when you're asking for what's the intended purpose. The same is true of participants. one of the sort of kisses of death that I've seen when it comes to behavior change is all right, now that we're coming to the end of the session, everyone is going to commit to the thing that they're going to do differently leaving the session. It's an immediately disempowering act for them, where now it's homework, right? This is not something that I'm doing because I want to change. Even if I did 3 seconds ago, now I'm being told I have to. For a lot of people, that, sort of shuts them off, right?
You thought we were going to disagree on this?
No, in general, Christopher, we disagree on this. That's why I knew this was going to be right in line. So
I was like, what? Yeah, no, I'm going to make the argument for mandatory one-size-fits-all behaviors for everybody. Are you kidding me?
No, not this. I'm saying in general, because you and I are cut from the same cloth, I think. But I've seen that too many times. Where it's like, how do we get people to shift behaviors after the session? It's like there's something embedded in the language around something you're doing to the participants, as opposed to if we have created an environment where people are being exposed to new information and given the opportunity to find for themselves why that matters, right? We call it the content context ratio. But if we give enough time to the space to talk it over, to really find the so what we have found is that most human beings like the idea of getting better and like the idea of being in service to their organizations, if only because it advances their career. There's desire there that's innate if we give it a chance to sort of grow and cultivate. So the best way we can do that is to invite participants to consider what was most useful from the session and what the value would be in realizing that behavior change. Then ask, right, what do you want to commit to and how can we help you realize that change?
Well, and I think on that point, and this isn't just related to learning. I see this in management. I see this in leadership. I see this in a lot of things. Far too often we treat adults like they're idiots. We treat them like they're children. And that is one of the most offensive, off-putting things that you can do to any human being, is to treat them as though they don't have the cognitive capability to have experienced something and go, here's something I think I can tangibly do about it. Because again, going back to this, anybody who's in a safe environment, let's just say that, because if you haven't created a safe environment where people feel that it's okay to be honest about things, that's a different situation. But if you've created that environment, any reasonable human being, which if you don't have reasonable human beings at your company, well, then then maybe you need to reevaluate your hiring process.
Yeah.
If you have reasonable human beings and you've created an environment where it's okay to acknowledge, hey, we've just talked about a lot of things. We've done this. People are naturally coming to these conclusions of, hey, I see where I could do better. And I see some of these tangible actions that I can take. And when we don't treat them with the dignity of and respect of saying, I don't need to babysit you. I don't need to give you something that my 2-year-old can figure some of this stuff out. Where it's like, hey, why do we not do that? And they can answer that. Why don't I treat adults with the same dignity and respect? And I think that's a real challenge where sometimes we're afraid, well, but if I don't do it, it won't happen. And I think sometimes this goes back to ego. Well, they won't do it my way.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Good. Because you're not them and you're not the one that has to live with that change. So get off your high horse and let them figure out what changes they need to make to be the best version of themselves.
100%. And yes. And then there's potentially an opportunity to help them on the how of realizing that change, right? Like that's the place where a lot of people don't actually know. We just haven't developed the muscle of intentional behavior change. So you can bring systems to help them realize that change when they've taken themselves to a place of, this is what I want to change and why. Beautiful, right? Then there's a beautiful opportunity as a manager to be more coach-like, or as a facilitator to be more coach-like, to help them on the how and realizing that lasting change.
So this brings me full circle to the actionable piece, because part of the challenge with this, and I'm actually really curious with this, and I know that some people are resistant to this because it can feel squishy. And this is one of the not dangerous, but this is one of the things that people are very uncomfortable with personalization, because what we just talked about becomes exponentially more complicated to measure. Because what we just said is, hey, you know what? You can't have a nice one size fits all. Everybody finishes the thing on this timeline and everybody changes this by this date. And that's a nice thing that you can measure.
Yep.
And I think that's why we've gravitated to that, because it's like, well, if they finish the thing in the LMS and they mark off their action plan and XYZ thing,
Right.
then I can feel good that all those behaviors changed, even though we know full well none of them did. But on the report, it looks nice. How is technology and how are some of the things you're doing making that more of a reality, so you don't just have to go to your stakeholders and go, trust me, people will get better. And they go, yeah, I don't know that I'm fully committed to just loosey-goosey seeing where things go.
Yeah, so there's a couple layers in there that I think are worth diving a little bit deeper on. So the first is that one thing I like about being in the corporate learning space as opposed to behavior change at large is that every learning program has a set of learning objectives. Each session has particular sort of content themes or content blocks. There are lanes around the behavior change that most people are going to engage in based on the session they just experienced, right? So what we found to be really effective is the hyper personalization, as in sample size of 1 for each specific commitment that someone's making to change, but that they can pretty easily, we're doing this pre-AI, but you can do it with AI as well. They can be grouped, right? So you can say thematically, these are the behavioral changes that are taking place. So that's piece number 1 is, in my experience, it needs to be hyper personalized. I need to have co-created this as a participant in order to maximize the likelihood that I'm going to stick with the change. Organizationally, I don't want to see the hyper personalization. I want to see things rolled up into aggregate as it pertains to our objectives. So that's component number 1. Component number 2, though, in there is the squishiness of, all right, so people committed to change, great. With actionable, we look at self-reported data as the next layer. So basically, because it's something that they've committed to, it's, if you think about like, your Whoop or your Fitbit around tracking your behaviors, like your health behaviors, it's sort of like
Fitbit. Like your Whoop, your what?
It's like your Whoop. Yeah, it's this thing. You see, it's one of those.
Oh, see, I'm an Apple guy.
Okay, so there you go.
I got it though.
So there, we found something to disagree on. How's that?
There we go.
Yes, that's it. So it's about me, right? The data is being shared in other places, but it's about me. That's why I wear the thing. We take the same approach. It's self-reported data around the behavior change. The discerning people will look at it. Well, it's self-reported. It can't mean anything. On an individual basis, no, we don't want to take the fact that Christopher rated himself as a 6 today as some sort of absolute truth around the behavior in place. But longitudinally and in aggregate, we can start to identify trends and themes through that self-reported data.
Yeah.
We can validate through 180s or 360s as long as we do those intelligently, which is probably a topic for another conversation. And then all of that is leading indicator data that if we've done the impact mapping at the beginning, going all the way back to the design process, we can start to correlate with the lagging data of the KPIs, right? The business internal data. It's not about replacing or by saying this is the absolute truth, the behavior change data, particularly self-assessed. What we are doing is shining a light on a previously invisible part of the process, which is the hardest part, where individuals are trying to engage in that change.
Okay. No, I think that's really helpful. And I think some of the actionable things people can take from this, one we talked about before, even just trying to identify this stuff earlier on.
Yep.
But also something that came out of that I think we need to be more intentional about is, we used to have these Franken opportunities, or it was like, come here and learn leadership,
right?
Which is like, holy gosh,
right?
That's 10,000 different things that you're now trying to jam into it, versus these more surgical, hey, we're going to focus on making you better at this skill. We're going to get better at this. And when you do it that way, it does then become easier. And again, you have to build more of a culture of, listen, we're not going to peanut butter carpet bomb everybody with stuff. We're instead going to say, hey, if you need to get better at this, here's an opportunity to get better at this. And then we're going to track how that's going, and then see, does that tie to the business side of things, as part of that holistic data story, versus let's do a one size fits all. We'll jam everybody through it. Then we're going to run some sales report 6 months later dissect it and go, I think that spike, pretty sure that spike,
Yeah.
that was the training right
That,
there. And I
exactly.
know because I feel really good about it.
Uh-huh. No, exactly. And that's the whole thing. I mean, I'm hypersensitive to correlation versus causality. And so being able to show a whole collection of data around behavior change, in particular behaviors over a period of time, and then an improvement in that metric, in the KPI, in the lagging metric, is a start. But then we need to go a layer deeper and start to slice it a little bit more if we care enough. I think the interesting part that I found, I've been so obsessed with linking the two, right? For 8 years now, it must be causality. We must be able to see that. And what I'm finding is that for all clients, no, they don't care. If we've got enough correlation and we're showing behavior change, that's substantially more than we were doing before. So this is good. Participants after the fact are saying, yeah, I actually shifted behaviors. I feel good about that. That's a huge win by itself, right? If you've done the work of saying these behaviors matter.
The fact you brought that up, I think, is a really encouraging point for folks, because if you're listening to this or watching this and it feels overwhelming, which
Yeah.
it can, because listen, if you're an organization out there that if somebody said, hey, can you show me the data about the behavior change in your organization? You go, ooh, yeah, we don't got that. You're not alone.
Right.
I mean, honestly, most organizations I talk to, all this effort of becoming a skill-based organization, all this stuff that you hear in the news and all this stuff, less than single digits are actually even doing stuff well.
I just want to reinforce that point. So actionable is being used in 8,000, a little over 8,000 organizations. I can count on two hands the number of times we've replaced an incumbent provider. They have had no behavior change measurement system before they brought actionable in. And that's a rounding error of companies that have, right? So it's changing.
So I think that can be encouraging, because you can feel like, oh, I just heard all this, or no, we're there. And sometimes you just throw your hands up and go, well, just forget it.
Yeah.
No, you're not on your own, but you can start to make, moves in this direction. And I think that's, let's make sure people know that, because it can be discouraging.
Well, and I want to take a step back, because I think the data is the exciting, sexy bit afterwards. But going back to the earlier part of our conversation here, it starts with what you're doing in your conversations with stakeholders. It starts with how you're designing the session. It starts with a focus on behavior change for the learner before you get into any of the measurement stuff. And so you have that ability right now. You don't need to spend any money on anything. You just need to make the decision to do that. And there's a bunch of resources at Actionable, totally free, on how to start some of those conversations as well, if that's helpful.
No, and I think that's really good, because again, going back to being more actionable, everybody who listens or watches this, you can go away from that. And even again, the simple question of, when you engage in a conversation, make that be a question you bring up. Are we trying to change a behavior here? Or is this just something, we're trying to make people feel good about the experience in a kind way, and go from there? And that can be a small change you can make that can suddenly start opening the door to this. Because to your previous point, I agree that it takes a level of organizational maturity for them to even be at a point where they're ready for some of this deeper skills behavior data. It takes a while to get there. And so it is a journey that you're taking everybody on, because if you start mastering this and then you go to your business stakeholders and go, here's all the behavior, literally, and they just are not ready for it. So again, there's a journey everybody can be on, that anybody can start on today.
Well said.
So on this could be a whole nother podcast episode, but I am really curious. I can go over a little bit, is with the technology piece though, because I'm actually extremely encouraged by what AI can do to help us with what you had said before, of being able to cluster and pattern some of this stuff that before was very, very difficult to try and understand. Where do you see technology helping shape this? And like we said before, you don't just throw AI at things and go, we figured it out. But where is it making things that before we would have gone, this is not scalable, and now it is?
So there's two core areas that we're focused on at Actionable. One is a right now thing, and one is a sort of just around the corner thing. So the right now thing is exactly as you said, on on the data, right? And so being able to look at a couple things, what are people committing to from a thematic standpoint, and being able to intelligently group those things, you
Okay.
can do obviously at scale, and that can happen now. Sentiment analysis can be really powerful in there. There's lots of off-the-shelf solutions for that right now too. So people committed to these things, but this is how they're feeling about it, and this
Okay.
is how they're feeling about it, right? Powerful. We look at 2 entries from each participant repeatedly. So they make a commitment, then the system pings them and asks them for 2 data points. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. How effectively are you creating change, and why? So we're getting a numeric data point and text-based. You can end up with sizable volumes of text-based data, and there is gold in there. So again, being able to use natural language processing, and again, there's a lot of off-the-shelf stuff. You can use OpenAI, ChatGPT plugins to make this happen on the cheap. That's quite powerful, and that's a now thing.
Okay.
What I think is even more exciting is there's an opportunity with AI, I believe, to upload lesson plans, upload strategic maps for the organization, and say, hey, based on this and other organizations like ours, what are the behaviors that we should be focused on improving, and how might we engage learners to a place where they understand what they have to change, but they've been given also the opportunity to identify why it matters to them.
Okay.
That's really exciting to me, where we can get into a rapid feedback loop of, here are the business priorities. This is what the learning experience is going to look like for participants focused on behavior change. When we do that well, and again, we're actively working on this. We're probably a year plus away from being in a place where that is, sort of stable. And which is also kind of exciting, because a year plus is like, it feels like we've been working on this for 50 years. It's right around the corner. I'm also a perpetual optimist, so don't call me on this on January 9th, 2025. But it's like, yeah, no, we're still going. So but I think there's something really interesting, because when we've used AI to intelligently design that, and we're measuring it, it moves it from being a linear journey on every
Okay.
learning program into a cycle, right? And you can get
Okay.
that flywheel going, which is very cool.
I love that, because again, I think there's just so much potential because again, a lot of people I know who go into this field, the data and analytics isn't always their sweet spot.
Mhm.
Also, it historically has been very time intensive
Mhm.
and very difficult to do. And I think there's so much opportunity for tech to make it easier so
Mhm.
that we can focus on the storytelling side of it. And how are
So
we taking those insights and focusing on the storytelling?
that right there is actually one of I skipped right over it, because it's so small but so powerful. Is a lot of folks in the L&D space, exactly to your point, they're people, they care, and that's a great thing. And some of them have built up a resistance to talking or thinking about the business metrics. And so often what the reporting looks like coming out is entirely HR focused. The CEO
Yes.
looks at it and goes, so what? You can use AI to very easily make some tweaks that don't manipulate the data, but what it does is shift
No,
the language to the story that's going
it
to just make it
personalizes the
fire.
story.
Yeah,
It's
to the
about
audience
personalizing
too.
the story so that maybe you don't know how to tell that story to a CEO or a CFO who has these questions, but you can use generative AI to say, I need to communicate
Yes.
things that would be most relevant to a CFO. Help me tell this story to this audience. And it can help quickly
Yep.
transform that in a way that you go, oh, okay. So now you can focus less on the pivot tables and the spreadsheets and this other stuff that you hate doing anyway.
Yep.
And then also, instead of trying to imagine you're someone else, you're using AI to help you do that so you can focus more on the relational components. And I
Yep.
think that's huge.
One of the easiest exercises you can do, even without AI on this, is as you start looking at whatever data you have, to half the room focused on shifting their empathetic listening skills, and they saw an improvement of 92% self-reported. Great. That might be exciting for us in HR. Follow that up with, and that matters because,
Yes.
thinking about and keep asking, keep adding, and that matters because, until you get to a place where it actually has some sort of commercial value to the business. That's
Yeah.
the beginning of the story. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one thing that is good that I have observed over the past years, I have noticed a trend and a greater understanding from business leaders, financial leaders, things like there is a greater understanding that, some of this stuff does matter. I
Yeah.
maybe don't fully understand why and how, but it isn't dismissed quite as much as like, well, that's just squishy stuff, which is good because it's like but you still, to your point, you have to add, and that matters because they may not always be able to connect the dots. Like I kind of know this is important,
Yeah.
but help me understand like where is the glue between this and what I care about. And
Yeah.
that's where the relational piece is huge.
This is just good communication practice, right? Like whoever you're talking to, put yourself in their
Yes.
headspace around whatever topic. I think, and I also,
Right.
just to your point, I want to walk back my comment about L&D people being sort of heart-centered people. It's obviously a very broad brush, and I would suggest, similar to your point, where the more sort of hard-lined black and white business leaders have been appreciating more of the people side. Also, people leaders have been, sort of moving their language and sophistication, and so I think they are absolutely meeting in the middle. We still need the bridge, right?
We do.
Which is
We do. And I think that's where we can play that role. And I think there's huge opportunity if we play our cards right to be extremely durable amidst all the AI technological changes, where a lot of people are going, what's my role in this new AI world? It's like this stuff, like this is where you can actually add real value and all this. So I told you we could probably have a whole nother episode just on that. So I'm going to close it because if I don't, we'll just keep talking. And we did find the thing we disagree about, which is which wearable. Although technically, if we were to deconstruct the behaviors we were trying to change, we actually probably agree more than we disagree. But let's not get there. So anyway, thank you so much, Chris, for joining me. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. Hopefully this has helped you think differently about what it means to change behavior, how you go about that, and how technology can play a leading role in that and making you do it well. So thank you for your time, Chris. Thanks everybody for listening. And we will see you back here next week.
Thanks, Christopher. It's a pleasure.